We are determined to see the fall of Zionism and imperialism, and we are determined to win.
We will weather all your attempts to cut us down, and just as the sun rises, we too will continue to rise until Palestine is free.
Salam, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Popular Cradle. It's Rhiannon here. I am here with Mohammed. Hi, Mohammed.
Hi, Rhi. Hi, everyone. Yara's not here with us today, but since our last episode, so much has developed both in Palestine and here in the U.S. And I think especially in the Gaza Strip, what we've seen is the collapse of the ceasefire. And I think collapse is a euphemism. Israel's unilateral breach of the ceasefire with full backing of the U.S., carrying out repeated massacres, the largest massacre of children since the beginning of this war. We've seen an escalation in the West Bank, expanded settler attacks against Palestinians trying to remain on their land. And all of this, obviously, as I mentioned before, with the full backing of the Trump administration. Honestly, when we did record the episode about the ceasefire a few months ago, we talked about the possibility of this collapsing, but I don't think we could have imagined what we're seeing today. It's still too soon to say what the final outcome of what we're witnessing will be. There's been talk of negotiations. There's been talk of different proposals. In the end, it's going to take some time before we understand fully what's at play. But without Yara here today, I think what we'll do is spend some time just discussing as two lawyers, with me and Rhi having our legal background, the developments here in the U.S. around repression and situating it within a broader context, a historical context of repression, the weaponization of different legal regimes, and how our movement should respond to it today, especially with the various cases that have taken the media by storm, the case of Mahmoud Khalil and so many others who are withstanding this brutal attack on the Palestine movement.
So let's jump in, just kind of setting the stage. There are people we know about who have been threatened by or detained by, targeted by immigration enforcement in this country. Many of these folks I'm about to name are currently, as we speak, as of this recording, sitting in immigration detention right now. I would imagine that every listener knows about Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia graduate student who is currently detained in Louisiana. Mahmoud Khalil is a green card holder, a U.S. permanent resident. There is Bader Khan Suri, an Indian student at Georgetown University who was detained by ICE but denied deportation. A judge did deny Suri's deportation. Momodou Tall is a Gambian British student at Cornell who is currently under threat of detainment, has been given notice by ICE that he needs to turn himself in, currently suing the government. Yoon Seo Chung, a Korean student at Columbia, was under threat of detainment and deportation, also currently suing the government. I believe, actually, as of today, a judge said that she could not be deported. There is Liqa Kordiyeh. This is a Palestinian from the West Bank. Kordiyeh was in the U.S. on a student visa. She is currently detained in Louisiana. There is Ranjani Srinivasan, an Indian student at Columbia, who was arrested and released and then fled the country. The government is calling it self-deported. She self-deported to Canada. And then just this afternoon, many of us watched in horror the video of Rumeysa Öztürk, a Turkish student at Tufts who was in front of our eyes, literally disappeared into a black unmarked van by ICE. The last I've read, her whereabouts are currently unknown. Her lawyer does not know where she is. So this is what's happening to immigrants who are being targeted right now for their pro-Palestine either activism or just expressing pro-Palestine views. And this context that we find ourselves in as a movement is what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, Rhi, it's really astonishing to think of all of these different names with each having individual stories, experiences. Some have been in the U.S. for years, like in the case of Chung. She's came to the U.S. when she was, I believe, only a child and has lived here since that. Or a person like Bader Khan Suri, who's only sort of crime, in quotes, is the fact that he was married to a Palestinian citizen who was vocal on Palestine. According to all reports, Suri himself wasn't really a politically active person, didn't express his views in any public way. So it's really difficult to say why the US government targeted him beyond his relationship to a vocal Palestinian wife. And so all of these different cases, I think, really highlight the extent to which the US government is willing to go to repress the Palestine movement. And I think Mahmoud Khalil's letter from prison, from the detention facility he's being held in Louisiana, really provides us the right context and understanding of this moment. And so I want to reference part of it. I'm not going to read it. I'm sure many of you have already read it or have heard it, but I think there's a few things in it that stand out. First of all, what stands out is the title itself, Letter from a Palestinian Political Prisoner in Louisiana, dated March 18th, 2025. That's names Mahmoud for who he is, a political prisoner in this moment, someone who's arrested and imprisoned for being a political activist.
Yeah, and evoking Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail.
Right. And the thing that stands out to me is Mahmoud actually doesn't start by sort of talking about his own experience beyond just the immediate. He mentions waking up to cold mornings and spending long days, bearing witness to quiet injustices underway against a great many people. So he's not talking about himself in this moment. He's talking about actually everyone else held with him. He mentions a Senegalese man who has been deprived of his freedom for over a year, who's separated from his family, which is across the Atlantic Ocean. He talks about a 21-year-old who stepped foot into the US at the age of 9 only to be deported. So these are actually the cases that highlight not just this moment's depravity, but the fact that this system that we have in place, that's been in place for decades around immigration, that's kidnapping people off the streets, separating them from their families, placing them in detention facilities for indefinite periods of time, and then sending them oftentimes to countries they've have really no foundation and no ties to. And this is the injustice that's being endured by people on a day in and day out basis before we ever heard of Mahmoud Khalil.
That's right. Yeah.
The other thing that Mahmoud talks about is the fact that this is a direct targeting of his free speech rights, a fundamental right that belongs to all persons present in the US. He talks about his family heritage, the fact that he was born in a refugee camp, the fact that his parents experienced Nakba. He talks about the fact that he is like other Palestinian political prisoners that are being held by the Israeli military under administrative detention. You know, another point that Mahmoud highlights is the fact that this is all for Gaza, that even as he writes this letter or dictates this letter, that parents are holding their dead children in their hands. And I think this is extremely important for us not to forget that all of this is for Gaza. The consequences that are being felt by the movement, by Mahmoud, by everyone else subject to this repression is for the people of Gaza, is for the people of Palestine. It's the opposition to the genocide that they're experiencing. And he talks about how the fact that his detention is a testament to the strength of the student movement in shifting public opinion, that this is why these attacks are coming. And finally, he talks about the human component of his experience, the fact that he wants to go home to witness the birth of his child, a human experience that I believe every single person held in detention has. Yeah. This is not unique to Mahmoud Khalil. This is not unique to pro-Palestine advocates. This is an experience of so many people, tens of thousands, if not millions, held behind bars under one law or another. And so I know today we're going to focus on the specific use of immigration law to target political activists, and that's going to be the sort of context that we spend the most time with. But the reality of it is this is not something that's just relevant to people interested in free speech or pro-Palestine advocacy, but is at the intersection of a number of different issues, all of which are human. And immigration and immigration enforcement is at the heart of that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Muhammad. I think like the creation of a political prisoner, when a political prisoner is created, which is to say, like, I've just been, this has been on my mind for the past few weeks that like when the government obviously creates a prisoner by imprisoning somebody. But then when that person politicizes their experience, when the movement politicizes their experience, the creation of that political prisoner, it shows us the reality of the politics that we live in today. And I think that's what you
Absolutely.
see from the creation of this political prisoner in Mahmoud Khalil, but all of these political prisoners that are being created by this repression regime. And so maybe we turn then a little bit to this legal context that we are in, talking about like, okay, what are the free speech rights of immigrants? Can somebody be deported for being pro-Palestine? These kinds of things. Now, in general, the baseline here, we're talking about the US Constitution. Immigrants have constitutional rights, right? The Constitution generally talks about quote unquote persons, not citizens.
Right.
Persons
Yeah.
have constitutional rights then. It's been interpreted by courts, not just if you are a citizen. So, in a very broad general sense, again, the foundation, Mahmoud Khalil, any immigrant, you don't have to be a citizen. When you're in the United States, you have a First Amendment right to free speech.
And this is
Now,
long established. This is
oh,
a,
yes.
a 200-year precedent. We're not talking about something that was born out of the civil rights movement in the 60s.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And now there is, people will hear lawyers on the news or whatever talking about the Mahmoud Khalil case, and they will say, but there is like some gray area. And that is because in the immigration context, specifically in the law, the executive branch, the president and federal agencies like DHS and the DOJ, they are historically given broad authority over immigration matters. This includes creating rules about immigration and having the power in the executive branch to enforce immigration laws in ways that the executive branch sees fit. So this also means that the free speech due process rights of immigrants have historically become targets for political reasons when the executive branch, right, is politicizing the free speech and due process rights of immigrants. So that's the kind of legal context that we're in. And there's a history of cases actually that show us that Mahmoud Khalil obviously is not the first person to be targeted in the immigration context for his free speech. He's not the first Palestinian to be targeted in this way by the US government. There's actually a long history of cases where Palestinian immigrants specifically are targeted in really similar ways. And I think we should talk about those.
Yeah, I think the sort of most salient case is the case of the Los Angeles 8th. And this is actually a case of 7 Palestinians and 1 Kenyan who were politically active in the 80s on the question of Palestine. And they were involved in passing out pamphlets, fundraising events, very basic things that you sort of expect of pro-Palestine advocates.
Or any political advocates, right? They're doing political expression, sharing their political opinions and advocating for their politics.
Exactly. And at the time, they were alleged to have been pamphleting or distributing materials on the PFLP, right? We're not talking about PFLP materials, but on the PFLP. And the government tried to prosecute them under a law that banned membership of a communist organization or organization that was advocating for world communism. That's
Right.
not the exact language of it, but that's the gist of it.
Mhm.
Now, this law itself was ultimately ruled unconstitutional under the First Amendment.
Yeah, it wasn't struck down under the First Amendment free speech provision, but actually under the freedom of association, the freedom of political association, which is also protected by the First Amendment.
Right. And so in the end, the government had to find another way to sort of target these 8 individuals. And so they turned to immigration. All of these were immigrants. And so the government essentially brought deportation proceedings against them for a variety of different reasons, similar to what we have with Mahmoud Khalil. They tried to target them for not taking enough credit hours, as a student to be on a student visa. They tried to target them for working at a convenience store while on a student visa. These different sort of what we call pretextual enforcement or selective enforcement of the law. You're not using the law for the law's sake to sort of right a wrong, so to speak. You're using it to attack someone, to punish them for things that they've done that you can't use the law to punish them for. And so the Los Angeles 8 eventually, as a long story short, repeatedly defeated the US government in court. And it's actually established precedent on different levels in terms of US case law that expanded the rights of immigrants to things like due process, to things like their First Amendment rights. And ultimately, all of them remained in the US, as far as I know, at least as far as what I've read. And they are now US citizens, all of them. It took decades for them to become US citizens, right? They were still sort of punished. They were never allowed to leave the country because they would have never been allowed back in. And so this LA 8 case is a first example. And the thing about the LA 8 case that's also really fascinating is that there was a broader context of an attempt to use immigration to repress permanent residents, legal permanent residents, people here on student visas for their political speech. And in fact, one of the LA 8 attorneys received a memo. It was leaked to him from within the US government about a plan to basically round up and detain over 1,000 permanent residents for their political speech and to sort of rid them of any constitutional protections to be housed in a camp in Louisiana pending their actual final deportation.
Yeah, just to read from this Politico report about these leaked plans to detain thousands of legal permanent residents. The 40-page memo described a government contingency plan for rounding up thousands of legal alien residents of 8 specified nationalities: Libya, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Tunisia, Algeria, Jordan, and Morocco. Emergency legal measures would be deployed, rescinding the right to bond, claiming the privilege of confidential evidence, excluding the public from deportation hearings, among others. In its final pages, the memo struck its darkest note: a procedure to detain and intern thousands of aliens while they awaited what would presumably become a mass deportation. There were plans to build a massive detainment facility on 100 outdoor acres in the backwoods of Louisiana. And I think it's important to point out here, this is in the 80s. This is in the late 80s that these plans are coming out. Listeners already know the story, I'm sure, of the United States creating internment camps during World War II for Japanese Americans. That is broadly known, taught in history classes as horrific, this horror, something that the US government did that was so wrong and universally understood as wrong. And you see decades later, in the late 80s, the US government trying to do it again, proposing explicit plans to do it again, this time to Middle Eastern, North African immigrants. And I think it's just really important to highlight this, the patterns here, the cycles that repeat themselves. And
Right,
what
the
we're seeing
repetition of
now,
history, basically.
exactly, what we see now in 2025 are, similar plans and similar patterns being attempted again by the US government.
I'm glad that you laid that out, Ree, because the similar plans and the similar utilization of immigration law to attack pro-Palestine advocates, the intersection of free speech, civil rights, due process rights, and immigration is again salient. And what's also similar is that there's a fight back. And I think that's extremely important to highlight because the plans of the memo never came to fruition, right? There was never an actual outdoor facility that was created. Thousands were never rounded up, even though that this threat was being, generated, and the examples, the low-hanging fruit, the sort of people that exist in the margins, the pro-Palestine advocates, right? These 8 individuals were supposed to be the sort of case study, the launching pad for this kind of work, eventually resulted in the defeat of all of these plans, right? And so I think we're now in that moment again. And, obviously there are going to be important differences. There are so many other cases that we can get discussed. There's Rafidi v. INS, which describes the case of Fuad Rafidi that helped establish that green card holders, legal permanent residents re-entering the country are entitled to due process rights and free speech rights. And what's interesting to note is that Fuad is actually Wissam Rafidi, the author of Trinity of Fundamentals' brother. This was a case that was in the Second Circuit, and it was presided over by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? It goes to show that actually at various junctures, especially throughout the 90s, Palestinians were the targets of these attempts to repress through immigration law. But in the end, through fighting back, both on a political level and through the court system, were able to expand the rights of immigrants in terms of their entitlement to due process and free speech. And so really, if we're to fast forward to the Mahmoud Khalil case, I think you're probably better positioned than me. But what are sort of the laws that they're trying to use with Mahmoud? What do you see as the main sort of both the political impetus, but the actualization of it through the legal facts that we see in Mahmoud's case?
Yeah, I think what's really important to highlight about Mahmoud Khalil's case legally is how the government started the case and now how the government is talking about the case. This brings up this idea of pretext, Muhammad, that you just talked about, that you just referenced, which is like, what reasons originally did the government say that they were coming after Mahmoud Khalil, which were purely, squarely the exercise of Mahmoud Khalil's First Amendment rights. The
They
government
didn't
was
even bother to hide it.
exactly. The government was saying this is a pro-Palestine protester and like we're going to deport him. Like that was the reasoning. And then now what's being added by the government are these pretext reasons. Allegations that Mahmoud Khalil did not accurately, fill out his green card application, did not accurately disclose his prior employment before he got into the United States.
Right. And the irony of it all is all of this is publicly available information on his LinkedIn page, right? It's not as though Mahmoud was hiding the fact that he worked for the British Embassy in Lebanon, or hiding the fact that he worked for UNRWA. It's publicly available information for whatever reason. And it's now being used, like you're saying, to say, well, oh, you intentionally attempted to deceive the US government in your application.
Right, right. And so, but what's going to play out in the courts, right, is these questions of the pretext, which we already saw, like in the LA8 case, is whether or not courts are going to say, no, government. First of all, those pretext reasons are not actually accurate, or no, government, these are actually pretext reasons. And what you're actually doing is punishing somebody for the exercise of their First Amendment rights, right? That is what is being worked out. Meanwhile, the Trump administration, we know this in the context, for example, of Venezuelan migrants who are being deported without any hearing to what is essentially torture prison camps in El Salvador. We know that the Trump administration is trying to fast track. They already have all this broad discretion in the immigration context to make their own rules and do this immigration enforcement. They're trying to fast track that to escalate their powers basically in the immigration context by evoking these really old, rarely used laws that give them power to deport people who they say are basically national security threats. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I
And-
think I think it's like at war with the U.S.
Right.
Like
Yes.
it's beyond national security threats. I don't remember the exact provision, but the way that they're reframing is that these people are members of a gang that are essentially at war with the U.S.
Yes,
And
that's right.
even though like the gang is clearly not at war with the U.S. I mean, it's not exactly those terms, obviously, but it's essentially what
It's
the
war or
pretext is.
invasion. Yeah, yeah. This is
Yeah.
the Alien Enemies Act. It's an old law from the 1790s that basically says, like, yeah, the U.S. can deport people who are citizens of countries that the U.S. is at war with or is being invaded by. And that's what the Trump administration is arguing gives them the power to deport these Venezuelan migrants without any process. There's no hearing. You are kidnapped by ICE. You are put on a plane. You are deported. That's it. And what I want to bring up here is a really important layer on top of the reference to these very old statutes that the Trump administration is saying gives them the power to deport people in this way. Where we're at in 2025 is actually like a post 9/11 context in which over the past 2.5 decades, this legal framework for continuing to consolidate power in the executive branch by allowing the executive branch broad discretion and broad authority to designate people, for example, national security threats, to designate organizations and groups as national security threats, to designate individuals and groups as terrorist supporting or terrorist organizations, broad legal power to accuse people of giving material support to terrorist organizations, right?
Yeah.
This means that, you can see that the Trump administration is layering all of these laws and, all of this history
And
to
invoking the same vocabulary, right? We're talking about terms like terrorism, terms like national security threat. And these terms, the idea isn't just to sort of broaden the powers, but to broaden the actual definitions, to loop in, to include different types of activities, conduct, vocabulary, words, whatever it might be that's needed in order to extend
yes.
enforcement power.
Yes, yes, and extend the government's ability to enact violence. Again, connecting, the Palestine movement to what else is happening politically in the belly of the beast and what the head of empire is working on, right? Trump invokes this exact language, wartime, national security threat, invasion, about the US-Mexico border, right?
Right.
Trump invokes these national security threat vocabularies around things like fentanyl, which he wants to designate as a quote unquote weapon of mass destruction.
And in
When
fact, the tariffs themselves, the implementation of the tariffs, which are must be done through legislative means, the pretext, the reason that he brings up fentanyl, like which is like people are have difficulty understanding, well, what do the tariffs have to do with fentanyl, especially coming from Canada, since there's not sort of this invasion of fentanyl coming from Canada, is because in order for him to be able to do so, he must invoke this. So
That's
the
right.
invocation itself is what allows for or facilitates the expansion and implementation of this power.
Right, right. And of like we, maybe it's too obvious to state when were weapons of mass destruction invoked most, sort of recently in the American memory to justify the war in Iraq, which of course killed 1 million people and which of course was a lie. So
Right.
again, just noting the
Yeah.
patterns and noting that this is how the empire operates. This is how the United States government operates and has operated for decades. But I think actually this says a lot about the movement for Palestine and how it has affected public opinion, how successful it has been at advocating for this cause.
Yeah. And like I think there's a couple of things that are really important for us to note, and especially the context that you invoke, this post 9/11 moment, is that the previous administration, including the previous administrations under Democratic presidents, whether Obama or before it Clinton or Biden over the last 4 years, they also facilitated the expansion of this executive power. They had several opportunities to do a number of different things, including, for example, roll back the Patriot Act, the actual law that was passed following 9/11 that expanded the US government's surveillance powers and these definitions, right? They had an opportunity to engage in immigration reform that would actually further protect immigrants, but instead what they did was deport people at a rate higher than actual Republican administrations. And in fact, in this moment, as we speak, the Trump administration has actually deported people at a lower rate than the Biden administration did in the same period of time. It's lost on people. The only difference sort of is the way the Biden administration does it, which is sort of behind closed doors through bureaucratic administrative means. They try to minimize the appearance of cruelty, whereas the Trump administration sort of dances in it.
Right.
Cruelty is the point,
Yeah.
right? They want to
Yeah.
make a big show out of it. And they want to also mobilize it for political repression purposes in a way that's it requires sort of the show. Like
Hmm.
if you want it to be effective in terms of chilling speech, in terms of sending a message, agitating your base, sort of delivering or appearing to deliver on promises that you won't deliver on including all of the economic promises you put on this show.
This is connected to the expansion of violence and the expansion of executive power abroad. Again, we understand this through a framework of imperialism. This is how the empire operates. This is how the empire operates in relation to other countries, in relation to the periphery, and that has implications for how the empire operates domestically as well.
Yeah, exactly, Ree. And I think if you think about it, the enforcement of immigration law domestically, the prison system, the militarization that we see at the borders and within our communities, the targeting of political activists for their positions against war, for their positions against genocide, for their support for the Palestinian cause, mirrors that the actual conduct abroad, the destabilization of countries that produce migration crisis, the economic sanctions and the debt that's created on countries of the global south that essentially produce an economic pool to the US. All of these things are sort of the flip side of those policies that
Yeah,
generate the crisis that results in people coming to this country or results in people mobilizing to oppose those things. And
exactly.
so I think the question before us, the question before the movement, in light of this history, in light of this context, is what do we do about it? And I think there's this sort of inclination naturally to want to sort of step back, hide, shrink.
It's
Uh,
scary.
it really is. It's a
It's really
terrifying
scary.
moment
Mhm.
because on the one hand, the reason that they pick off these marginalized or marginal figures, so to speak, right? The immigrant or the pro Palestine advocate or the person who's been arrested or the person who's a member of a gang is so that we all naturally say, well, I'm not them,
Yeah.
right? Like it's to isolate us from them so that our response is to shrink away. The second reason is to send a clear message that you too can be a victim. All we need is the pretext. We
Yes.
will expand, we will figure out the way. We will package it nicely. We will call you a terrorist supporter. We will call you a gang member. We will call you whatever we need to call you. We will vilify you in the media and in the courts. And ultimately, people do not want to be under that sort of scrutiny or that light or that description. I mean, no one wants to have their picture with Shalom Mahmoud on it by the
Right.
White House Twitter,
Yeah. Yeah. Or that disgusting the White House posting a quote unquote ASMR video
right?
of Latino detainees, right? Handcuffing them, chaining them, making an example out of them.
Yeah. It's really about producing this in group, out group dynamic. It's playing to a base that wants to sort of launder their frustrations, their anxieties, their feelings about their realities through the suffering of others. And I think for us as a movement, our response is to fight back ultimately, right? It's to show the movement, these people, everyone around us, that we're not scared to stand up for ultimately what are our rights. And if you think about it, the expansion of civil rights, the expansion of the First Amendment, of due process rights, the actual amendments that have been enacted to the Constitution, the very civil rights provisions that were passed in the 60s and the 70s, those were all things that were enacted in response to repression and despite repression,
That's right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And it was because we fought. We fought for our future. We fought for our past. We fought for all the people who ultimately were the victims of these different policies. And so I think that's where we need to be today.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, it makes logical sense. It's the only response. If you are being picked off one at a time, if it's on the margins, and we should say that the marginalized are created, right? It's not an organic a set of circumstances, right? Immigrants do not have to be marginalized. They are
100%.
marginalized. And if that's where the repression is being targeted, we have to understand, first of all, that that is about individualizing, creating individual examples to spread mass fear. And that actually rationally, logically, it only makes sense. The only response has to be collective response. Our
Right.
collective defense, bravery in our masses, showing up in our collective to demonstrate that strength, to demonstrate that opposition. And I think it's really important to think about collective strength, but for every individual to think about how they are potentially a part of that collective, right?
Yes.
And showing up in that movement. Because the reality is, you hear like, well, you know, if they can come for a green card holder, then eventually they can come for a citizen. These kinds of like, it's the argument about why we should care about this is like a snowball effect kind of argument
Right.
or something
Right.
like that. I think that's true. I think that's galvanizing and that's motivating, and that speaks to certain people's experiences. And if that's what's motivating to them, that's fantastic. But I also think, again, with reference to this idea of the political prisoner, them picking off people. Think about what that represents. Think about the political reality that is being exposed to you, which is that if someone can be disappeared for believing that genocide should stop, you don't have a First Amendment right. And it's not that you don't have a First Amendment right and that's why you should join the movement. It's that everybody should be angry and should be motivated to action for it being revealed that we live in a society where the rights we are purported to have are not actually true. That
Yes.
applies to everybody.
100%.
If migrants
100%.
are disappeared, right, without due process, you do not have due process rights. The due process right is actually a fiction, right? And that's what should be motivating to all of us. And in fact, I think it's our only response, actually. The only way you oppose, the only way you confront a repressive regime like this, a campaign of repression like this, is in our masses. And I think people should be letting Mahmoud Khalil and Venezuelan migrants and genocide reveal to them, maybe for the first time, that's okay, how the empire works, how fascism works, that this is a massive fascist experiment for what the government can do. And there is no max level of violence. There is no max level of marginalization that fascism or the empire will be satisfied by. There is no ceiling on this. It's a machine that runs on oppression. It runs on displacement. It runs on disenfranchisement. It runs on genocide. And it doesn't stop unless it is made to stop.
Right. 100%. I mean, essentially what you're saying, Ree, is rights are not just things that are individually held,
That's
right?
right.
Like by each and every one of us. Rights are themselves a restraint on the government. And so
Yes.
to the extent that rights are violated, that restraint is being lifted off the government. And if it's being lifted off the government, then it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So your individual right is not secured.
Yeah.
And so I think the sort of path ahead of us is very clear. I'm glad we had this discussion. I know it wasn't sort of a part of what we were hoping to do with this episode, but as with being in this moment and being people who have our ears to the ground about what's happening to everyone around us, and Palestine is not just something that exists in the region or thousands of miles away, but Palestine is here everywhere around us. And for us, it's our moment to stand up, not just for the pro-Palestine advocate or not for the principle of free speech or the principle of due process or for the migrant. It's to stand up for what we want the world to look like.
Yes.
A democratic, pluralistic world where people are not just free to stand up against genocide, but moved to stand up against genocide and moved to stand up for one another.
Well, I think that brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Popular Cradle. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for following and sharing our episodes. We hope that the legal discussion today was bearable, hoping that it was even educational. And we will see you next time on Popular Cradle. But we should also say April 5th, Saturday, April 5th at 1 p.m. in Washington, D.C., there is a march on Washington to stop the genocide, to stop this repression, to protect our students, to protect immigrants, and to demand an arms embargo now. So we will see you on the next episode of Popular Cradle. We will also see you in the streets. You can head to the website marchforpalestine.org for more information. Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.